Let me begin, as we start the theme of where have we come from, where are we going, with just a couple of quotes. One is from a very fine book, which is now sadly out of print, 1984. Make a note of it for those of you who've been at L'Abri and would like a refresher course, not from a L'Abri writer, but his name is Willis Glover, Glover, and it's called The Biblical Origins of Modern Secular Culture. The Biblical Origins of Modern Secular Culture. Published by Mercer, M-E-R-C-E-R, 1984. And it's quite the finest overview that I know of in terms of helping you to understand what I'm going to be quickly sketching now in this session. But just one quote from that. A sense of meaninglessness frustrates many sensitive and talented people. We are experiencing a crisis of faith more complex and profound than anything known in the West since its origin in the early Middle Ages. Early Middle Ages, in his view, would take you right back to the first millennium. Notice how he says, we are experiencing a crisis of faith more complex and profound than anything known in the West since its origin in the early Middle Ages. On the positive side, it's a very striking challenge to us, is this quote about Bonhoeffer, Dietrich Bonhoeffer. As you know, he could have stayed in the United States, as some of his colleagues had done from Germany, and he went back, and it says, when he returned from London in 1935, he became the head of a confessing church seminary at Fingenwalde. I don't know where that is, Finkenwalde. His innovative and inspired leadership of this seminary stands as one of the most significant contributions of his career. Now, we know his writings, but I had never known about this. Now, what was it? Note, he embarked on this new project, recognizing that German Protestantism had proven itself nearly bankrupt. He sensed that his context required, and this is why I'm reading this, a revolution in theological education that would demand of confessing church ministers profound spiritual discipline, pure biblical theology, and now note, and an orientation to service over privilege, and a community life. These words I find very striking. A community life rooted in uncommon intimacy and intensity. If you read the basic principles of operation that the Schaeffers wrote at the very beginning of L'Abri, the word that keeps coming out is reality, reality, reality. The reality of this, both in terms of thinking, but more importantly in terms of the living, the community. A community life rooted in uncommon intimacy and intensity. The second is from an unlikely source, famous British philosopher by the name of Alistair Mcintyre, who wrote a book called After Virtue in 1987, a study in moral theory. Complicated book, but he ends, page 261, these are the last sentences of the entire book, with a reminder of the importance of those little communities of Benedictine monks, which started in the 6th century. So here's this complicated text on moral philosophy, and he gets to the end, and this is the punchline. It is always dangerous to draw too precise parallels between one historical period and another, the collapse of the Roman Empire, okay, at that period, when Benedict was just starting. But he goes on, he says, a crucial turning point in that earlier history occurred when men and women of goodwill turned aside from the task of shoring up the Roman Imperium, the government, the whole system, turned aside from shoring up the Roman Imperium and ceased to identify the continuation of civility and moral community with the maintenance of that imperium. In other words, they realized that something dramatically new had to be initiated. It had got so bad, something else had to be created. What they set themselves to achieve, I'm continuing, instead, often not recognizing fully what they were doing, was the construction of new forms of community within which the moral life could be sustained, so that both morality and civility might survive the coming ages of barbarism and darkness. If my account of our moral condition is correct, we ought also to conclude that for some time now, we too have reached that turning point. What matters at this stage is the construction of local forms of community within which civility and the intellectual and moral life can be sustained through the new dark ages which are already upon us. And if the tradition of the virtues was able to survive the horrors of the last dark ages, we are not entirely without grounds for hope. This time, however, the barbarians are not waiting beyond the frontiers, the Goths and the Visigoths and the Huns and the Vandals, okay. They have already been governing us for some time. And it is our lack of consciousness of this, hear me carefully, and it is our lack of consciousness of this that constitutes part of our predicament. Last sentence. We are not waiting, we are waiting, not for a Godot, G-O-D-O-T, Sam Beckett's character, waiting for a Godot, but for another, doubtless very different, Saint Benedict. That's the end of the book. Striking, isn't it? Right, I mentioned that I hope to sort of mitigate some of the sense of gloom that I may have created. I do feel we're facing a very, very serious situation. And I want now to try to sketch that. I realize, as I said earlier, those of you who've been to L'Abri, a lot of this will be very familiar. But I think it's helpful to regain a historical perspective. It's one of the things that we've lost. And it helps us to realize where we've come from and then hopefully what we need to do in order to move in a different direction. Now, I've got a few slides just to illustrate this. Can you all see that? We'll raise it a bit. Titanic 2. It seems to me that our situation today could be compared to a warship in the Gulf zone which fires 2 missiles. If we're to understand our situation, we have to realize that for about 300 years now, forces have been let loose in the society which have gradually undermined Western civilization. So as he says in that quote, barbarianism is not on the outside, it's now on the inside. That's what we're suffering from. So we have this enormous task of somehow regrouping and doing something about it. Now, what were those forces that were released back at the time of the Enlightenment? The Enlightenment, if you just put a round figure on it, sort of middle of the 18th century. So before the French Revolution, these philosophers, sometimes called the encyclopedists, Voltaire, Diderot, Rousseau, all of them incidentally responding in some way to your great Scottish philosopher David Hume, and especially then eventually Immanuel Kant, who wrote his 2 great works in response directly to the work of David Hume. From that period up until the present, I'm arguing that there have been 2 forces, rather like missiles fired from a ship, which, because of some malfunction, instead of reaching their target, have turned back on themselves and are actually headed for the launch ship. And that is the nature of the disaster that we are facing. And the 2 elements that it seems to me we have to understand are science on the one hand and freedom on the other. Like motifs, which you keep hearing in a beautiful piece of music. These are not wrong in themselves. They're in fact great ideals. You think of the ideal of freedom leading to democracy, the French Revolution, equality, liberty, fraternity, which then produced the very modern sense of democracy, as we understand today. Adult suffrage, all of that appeared from that. Not a wrong ideal, nor was the ideal of science. In fact, living in Cambridge, one has this daily reminder of Isaac Newton, who in the little rooms just to the right of the entrance to Trinity College wrote his great work in 1687 called Principia Mathematica. Or you think of Boyle at the very end, 1694, not from Cambridge necessarily, but who wrote this book called The Christian Virtuoso, in which he described the greatness of a Christian scientist because, as he said, the natural philosopher, the scientist who is a Christian, is able to show even more the greatness of the God who has created all things. So it wasn't a false ideal, it wasn't an incorrect ideal, the ideal of science. But my point is this, that because these were taken out of the context of the framework of a Christian view of reality, and very specifically of a God who had created all things, and then a God who had come to redeem all things. Right? Because of that being rejected, that was the main theme of the Enlightenment, thus making it, in fact, the Endarkenment. Right? What actually happened was that these have turned back as they've developed, and that's what I want to try to trace with you, is how these themes, these motifs, have worked themselves out in the culture. And because they lacked that framework, which actually gave rise to the civilization that we have enjoyed, because they lacked that framework, they have become utterly destructive. So turning back on themselves and implosion as a result. Now, I want to just sketch that out very briefly, and I hope we can have time. I'm sure you will be provoked by me in what I say, in the sense that not all of it you will agree with, but also secondly you realize I'm just giving a sketch, so I can't go into details. And one of the dangers of doing something historical like this is that one is misrepresenting so much in the broad panorama. So forgive me that and bear with me. But it seems to me, as you look back behind the Enlightenment to the Reformation, so you have 1500, Luther, Cranmer, etc., 1600, 1700, here comes the French Revolution. And I'm suggesting here you have the Enlightenment. And then coming on up to the present, the picture I'm trying to represent here is of a wall which was being constructed, our civilization and its progress. And of course there's much beyond this, the Middle Ages that were referred to, Benedict right down here at 500, okay, do you see what I'm saying? And a slow growth of development, so I'm not suggesting it started here. But to understand our particular dilemma now in the West, and I'm thinking particularly now of the UK and the United States of America, you have the Enlightenment as a counter-Reformation. So what the Reformation was seeking to accomplish, which was to put the Bible at the center, not just of the church's life, sola scriptura, but to put it at the center of the political life, of the whole culture. What you have in the Enlightenment is a desire to break free from that, to shatter that view of reality. And what I suggest we see is that subsequent to that, the whole structure has become unstable. And the further you come towards where we are, 2000, okay, further you come up to the present, the more unstable it becomes. And imminently to collapse, in my view. Now, by saying that, I'm not saying it's going to disappear. It's going to become something very, very different than we have enjoyed in the past. So you think, for example, political freedoms. I do not believe we are going to continue to enjoy the kind of political freedom we've had in the past. And hence I've mentioned here the rule of law. Another thing to see in this diagram is that you have the beginning of modern science, you see down here, in the period before the Enlightenment. so often science is viewed as if it has been the solution to everything and as if it started in the period after the Enlightenment. This is to misunderstand it. Science began down here. I've taken the date somewhat arbitrarily of 1609, Galileo, okay? But you could go for the Novum Organum, again, somebody whose statue is in the Antechapel of Trinity College Chapel, Francis Bacon, the first martyr of science. You will remember how he took a chicken and went outside and he stuffed snow into it, hoping thereby to, just to carry out an experiment to see if it would preserve, which of course he was on the right track, preserve the meat, and caught a chill and then died from that. So the first martyr of experimental science. But Francis Bacon, 1620, the Novum Organum, the new organ by which we will solve our problems. Okay? And so it started within a Christian environment, Isaac Newton, 1687, and it was only later that it was, to use my terminology, hijacked by humanism. That is the great deception of the modern world, as if science is somehow against or independent of a Christian view of reality. And one of the greatest challenges before us is to reverse that, to show that in fact science belongs to Christianity. It belongs both historically. I'm not saying that science is impossible outside of a Christian context. You have Chinese science and Arab science and so on. So I'm not saying that it is impossible, but the only one within which it can flourish is a Christian view of reality. So, for example, one of the things that the reformers were immediately at an advantage in was that they had already rejected Aristotle as an authority. Aristotle was controlling Catholic science, if I can put it like that, because he controlled Catholic theology. That immediately put the Protestants at an advantage. So what I'm trying to show is that as science has developed, and then the blue here is the growth of humanistic philosophy, a philosophy independent of the Bible, to varying degrees resistant to the Christian view of reality. As that has happened, it's become more and more unstable. I think you see this in a very practical sense, that fewer and fewer people from our own culture are wanting to do science. So in Cambridge, as you walk up and down Cambridge, you just see thousands, literally thousands of people from other cultures who've come to do science. Why? The places are there. Why are we not producing science? Too much like hard work. Not cool. So I think even science is now in danger within the West. The rule of law was created, of course, during the Civil War, in the sense not that it came to final fruition, not as if it was completely without problems, but in the Civil War, 1642 following, basically what they were fighting for was this principle of the rule of law, and very specifically Christian law, that God's word was the governing principle for the whole of society. That's the conflict with Charles I and the reason why he was beheaded, etc. Now note, this was way before the Humanist Revolution. And the contrast between 1688, what's called the Great Glorious Revolution of William III, etc., and the French Revolution, which comes here, is dramatic. So this one is called the Bloodless Revolution, 1688. And this one, just think of the Reign of Terror. And so you have the contrast of all the revolutions coming subsequently here. You think of the Marxist Revolution up here in the 20th century, echoing the French Revolution. Right? So that is just an overarching frame within which to see what happened from the Enlightenment to the present. And I want to trace out those two themes as I've described them. Now, the first, what I'm trying to depict here is from the Enlightenment, okay, so 1800, is a development of the same theme, and each time expressed, this is the theme of freedom, each time expressed in a way which is more dramatic, more destructive. So beginning in the early 1800s, you have the freedom motif being expressed by the Romantics. I'm thinking of the Romantic poets in particular. And to begin with, if you contrast it with something later, for example, the hippie movement more than a century later, what you find is this is very mild, very cultured and civilized by comparison with this. And my argument is that as you come closer to the present, that same theme of freedom, and what do I mean by freedom? I mean, for example, if you give up God, then what is your moral authority? And the claim of this missile that's gone astray, the claim of this motif of freedom is that as we get rid of God, we'll be more and more free. And in actual fact, what we have found is something utterly destructive as we come to the present. So a dehumanizing influence within the society, the growth of violence, opposition to the family, or the relegation of family into a position of irrelevance, practically, in the present, with all of the practical consequences, some of which Susan will be dealing with this afternoon. So the picture that I have in my mind as I show you this diagram is of standing on the west coast, like in Wales or in Cornwall, and watching the waves come in, and you want to surf, and you wait for the big wave, and you wait, and each wave that comes in, you say, no, this is not big enough, this is not big enough. And actually, as you come to the present, the wave is getting bigger and bigger. The destructive aspect of that freedom motif is seen more and more. So, I mean, this is just common knowledge. I mean, you hear people talking about it all the time. The individualism of the society creating anarchy in every direction. I mean, think of the schools. Our son has just been teaching at a school where it is impossible to teach, practically. So you count it a good lesson if you make it to the end. The crisis in education is related to this sort of subject. So you'll have questions, I know, as we come to the end. But going through Romanticism and then Bohemianism at the end, here's somebody like Oscar Wilde. There is one quotation I must read you, which indicates the force of all this well. Here is Rupert Brooke in a book called The Neo-Pagans, by a man called Paul Delaney. Rupert Brooke, of course, is associated with Cambridge. He was at King's, then was part on the fringes of the Bloomsbury group, Virginia Woolf, Lytton Strachey, Maynard Keynes, E.M. Forster, people like that. Incidentally, I have a fascinating article, if anyone wants to pursue it, by a Jewish writer, Gertrude Himmelfarb, written in the middle 80s, tracing the descent from Clapham, the Clapham sect, that's the evangelicals surrounding Wilberforce, who had such an influence in Parliament in the abolition of slavery, and who were responsible for what's called the Reformation of Morals, and the Bloomsbury group. So the title of her paper is From Clapham to Bloomsbury, tracing the descent physically. So some of them, like Virginia Woolf, was descended from one of the members of the Clapham sect, Stevens. And her point is that as you come down from the evangelical renewal at the beginning of the 19th century, in the early 1800s, what you find when you come to the Bloomsbury group is that it's all just been shot to ribbons. And the hope that the intermediate members of the family had was that you could give up Christianity and keep the morality was finally dead, with Virginia Woolf and all of her associates. Well, Rupert Brooke was, wandering around Grantchester with Virginia Woolf and swimming in the nude in the river, etc. And listen to what he said: "We'll be children 77 years instead of 7." Can you hear the echo of the hippies, or rather the prelude to the hippies? We'll be children 77 years instead of 7. We'll live romance, not talk of it. We'll show the grey, unbelieving age. We'll teach the whole damn world that there's a better heaven than the pale, serene, Anglican, windless, harmonium-buzzing eternity of the Christians. A heaven in time. Notice, you see, it's all so romantic. I mean, come on, be honest. Let's tell me, what are you talking about? A heaven in time, now and forever, enduring for each, staying for all. A heaven of laughter and bodies, all these with capitals, and flowers and love and people and sun and wind, in the only place we know or care for, on earth. Now then there's a comment on that quote by the author, Paul Delaney. It was a paradise that would turn the Christian one on its head, but what else would it do? So he died in 1915 during the war. Here's another more striking one from colleagues, Lytton Strachey, who wrote the famous book Eminent Victorians, as a direct challenge to the Christian view that had prevailed. We can't be content. He's writing to Maynard Keynes, the famous economist who was also in Cambridge, a member of the Apostles. We can't be content with telling the truth. We must tell the whole truth. And the whole truth is the devil. It's madness for us to dream of making dowagers understand that feelings are good. You see, it's part of this whole expression of freedom is that, and the Romantics started it. I mean, you think of Wordsworth. I wandered lonely as a cloud, you know, the enjoyment of the daffodils, all fine and good, and something that Christians can endorse thoroughly. But outside of the Christian framework, where does it take you? So it's madness for us to dream of making dowagers understand that feelings are good when we say in the same breath that the best ones are sodomitical. Now notice this last phrase. This is the telling phrase. Our time will come 100 years hence. Our time will come 100 years hence. And that is the reality within which we're living right now. So these are the sorts of things I'm trying to show in this diagram, is that as you cut loose from the Christian view of freedom, the Christian view of freedom is that we have a framework which we must respect, and that framework is God's person and his law. And this, as we enter into it, doesn't make us less free, it makes us more free. You will know the truth, and the truth will set you free, says Jesus. Why? Because you're actually constituted as the image of God, to love God and to love your neighbor, to live within a framework of law. Cut loose from that, and you are destroyed. Schaeffer's famous illustration of the fish taken out of the water and put on the bank is no longer free. It's only free in the environment for which it was created. So we have this sad situation of the intensity of this freedom principle mounting, and we wonder what we can do about it. So that's the freedom motif. On the other side, in terms of the science motif, what do we have? I've tried to express here in a slightly different format. You'll see I've got three columns here. This one is philosophy. Let me raise it for you. Philosophy, technology, and ideology. Thinking of technology for a moment, here's the Industrial Revolution. First the Agrarian Revolution, and then the Industrial Revolution. And 1800, you think, for example, of the huge factories going up all over the place. These huge trundling steam engines which used to plow the fields. And you think of what's happened in technology to the present, and how there's just been this mushrooming of the influence of technology into the society as a whole. But what I'm trying to show here is that in these three areas, philosophy, technology, and ideology, again, as it has been taken out of the framework of a Christian worldview, it has ended up being destructive. So in terms of philosophy, you find in the 19th century the main theme was naturalism. That is, there is only nature. There is no supernature. So we get rid of the Bible, well then what are we left with? Well, we're left with science. You see. So philosophy beginning to try to express itself more and more in terms of the scientific view of reality. And so ending up with people like in the beginning of the 20th century, A.J. Ayer in Oxford, logical positivism. You see, positive just meaning the things which we can touch in his way, in his view, only statements which can be measured with the senses, experienced with the senses, can be described as sense. Everything else is nonsense. So you can't see God, nonsense. You can't touch God, nonsense. You can't see the soul, nonsense, etc. And this is the philosophy which prevailed right up into the early part of the 20th, and in a sense, right up to the middle of the 20th century. Then it was challenged, and people began to realize that it couldn't answer the big questions. It wasn't answering the questions. And so you had the development of what's existentialism, beginning with phenomenology on the continent with people like Husserl, Heidegger, and then coming to expression in the common domain amongst people reading novels and so on with Camus, C.A.M.U.S., and Jean-Paul Sartre, his play No Exit, for example. And so in that period, the first challenge, which when I was a student at Cambridge, was coming to expression. When I first went to L'Abri, there were existentialists around. And they were struggling with this problem of, if we are living, and this was my own, actually, what brought me to Christ, was that I gave up Christianity and walked out of a church in Johannesburg on one occasion saying, I do not believe in the Father, I do not believe in the Son, I do not believe in the Holy Spirit, at the time of the blessing. And through the next 18 months, I struggled with the implications of that. Okay, if that's the case, then what is the reality? And what I went through in my own experience was, in a way, what the existentialists were just describing, which culminates in a view of absurdity. Life is utterly absurd. So you have the development of the theatre of the absurd, and I was able to attend some of the first plays that came out during that period. Gionesco, Exit the King, Rhinoceros, you remember the names, Sam Beckett, Waiting for Godot. All of them expressing the sense of utter meaninglessness. In fact, that was one of the plays that Sam Beckett wrote, called Lessness. And he just took a number of phrases within which the suffix was lessness, meaning lessness, pointlessness. So there was already a realization in the middle of the century, is what I'm saying, is that there are no answers philosophically. But because of the force, the power of science and the direction of the culture as a whole, it hadn't actually gone into the public domain. And that is where postmodernism comes in. Postmodernism is simply an existentialist view now made public to the world and carried out into every aspect of life. There are no answers, there is no truth, everything is relative, etc. Nihilism with a smile, though, as someone described it. Now, where does that lead us to? And I'll come back to that in terms of 2000. Over on the other side, in terms of ideology, just a quick sketch. Here you have, again, working itself out logically. So you've given up God. So in terms of political life, you no longer have the Bible as a code, as a basis for morality, for lawmaking. What do you have? And the main theme is nationalism. So you have Byron shooting out from Cambridge as a young man, going out to help the Greeks liberate themselves from the Ottoman Empire. Do you feel it? And then you have all these movements like the unification of Italy, to get all the Italians together. And then Germany, the unification of Germany, 1870, etc. As if that is going to solve the problems socially of the human race. Now, it's still alive. I'm not saying it died. But it obviously didn't produce the answers. And so you move up into the 20th century and you have socialism. Marx down here and his work becoming the basis of Marxism, a type of socialism, National Socialism, Nazism, and then Marxism, communism. And in each case, coming up to the present, a realization, and this is one of the themes of postmodernism, science has no answers, philosophy has no answers, ideology has no answers. We've seen the demise of communism. There are no political answers. Now, I've put in yellow in the middle, and this is what I will end with, is this larger. I wish I could make it larger again. I wish I could make it double the size here. I wish I could somehow have an audio attached to it to make the point that we have been overwhelmed at the same time by the developments in technology, which without any framework within which to be disciplined and controlled, have just run amok. As John Roberts puts it in his very fine book, Historical Survey, called The Triumph of the West, and he doesn't mean it in a simple sense as if we have triumphed, and that's great. It's actually a bit of a lament. It's just a statement of reality, the triumph of the West. This is a documentary series in the middle of the 80s. But he describes the effect of all of this as the sorcerer's apprentice. The little boy who learnt the trick of how to switch on this automaton to get an answer and then didn't have the right words to stop it. And I think when you put the two together, the way I see it, just to simplify it, is that you've got two forces that have converged at our moment in history. And that's why I cited all of these examples in the earlier session, that we're not just alone in this. This is recognized by Christian and non-Christian alike, that we are in a dramatic moment in history. And the two forces are these. You have, philosophically, the realization increasingly that we have no answers, and technologically, you have greater and greater power placed in the hands of mankind, for good or ill. So that is our moment in history. Now, in the very top, I've just tried to describe diagrammatically that we face a possibility. It is a possibility only, okay, that for the first time we might have something which has elements, common elements, linking all three of these, where previously they have developed in isolation. You think of philosophy, for example, and politics, and then technology, each as kind of separate spheres almost, hardly bearing on one another at all. What I'm suggesting is that from the sheer pressure of what's developed, there might be solutions suggested which will bring the three together. And I put New Age up here, the basis of which is really, it's the old age, it's the old ideas of finding our solutions religiously through our common experience as creatures of the earth, of the oneness of our experience as part of nature, and turning back to what is the essence of pagan religion. You think of the cycles of nature, etc. What is the most striking? I don't have time to read it. One of the striking expression of this is Václav Havel, the president of the Czech Republic, gave a major speech in the United States about 5 years ago, in which he says, now we realize that we have to have religion. So here is someone who comes out of an atheistic background, okay, himself personally. Fine writer, brilliant writer, becomes president, goes to the United States and says, only a God can save us. Notice only a God can save us. Not only the God can save us, but only a God can save us. So a tremendous sense where previously when I was a young student, it wasn't the done thing to think religiously, and now it's common property. Now everyone is suggesting you need a religion. Okay? So that's what I mean by New Age. My fear is that it's going to be a New Age, it's going to be a religion which seeks unity independently of truth. In other words, paganism. Over here you have, at the same time, as a sense of the new community, what Marshall McLuhan called the global village, a sense that we need some greater force politically to keep the whole thing contained. So you have the development of the International Monetary Fund. We have seen, even in the last 2 decades, what the G7 has become. The groups of 7 nations, the big nations. And I have an article in which one of the foreign ministers recommends that the G7 be given executive power. In other words, the thing is so chaotic. Just think of Africa, for example. Think of the collapse of the economies in the East, just overnight. Japan, Korea, Thailand. And imagine what would happen if there was a major economic collapse. Incidentally, if I could just go back quickly to this diagram, you may be wondering what I'm meaning by this. That is, I think what sustains us at the moment is simply our economic power. And if there was I use this as a sort of illustration of a buttress holding up the wall. It's a very bad illustration, but you know how if you take a buttress away of a wall that is tottering, it'll collapse. And if we had a major economic disaster internationally, one wonders what one would see. But anyway, to conclude, the center of the whole of our concern internationally is what I call financialism. You have a global market, global economy, and somebody up there, and I'm not thinking of conspiracy theories, etc. It's just the way things have developed, the way things have progressed through technology, etc. Someone is going to be having to hold this whole thing together. So just take the development of the G7. They started as the finance ministers. So the finance ministers of the US, Germany, France, etc., UK, gathered together for a meeting because they needed to think about how they were going to handle all of this. And very soon it became the president and the prime minister's meeting, the G7. And so they've had an annual meeting since. So where is it all going? Where are we going? I've tried to sketch where we've come from. As I said, there is this principle of God's surprises. One prays for that. But this is the seriousness of our moment, and if we're going to be living in the challenge of the 21st century, this is the reality that we have to face. I just reiterate what I said at the beginning. I don't think there are any easy solutions. I think some of the things which we in L'Abri have struggled for, as I mentioned them, a recovery of truth, a recovery of community. These things are non-negotiables. We must go back to these basics, and just pray that the Lord will lead